In the summer of 1956, a worker on Detroit's East Side walked out of a factory gate for the last time, and behind him, 3.5 million square feet of the most advanced industrial architecture on Earth began to die. Not in an explosion, not in a fire, but slowly, silently, over 68 years. This building once produced the most prestigious automobiles in America, cars owned by presidents, czars, and movie stars. During the Second World War, its assembly lines built the engines that powered the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that broke the Luftwaffe over Europe. At its peak, 40,000 people worked inside these walls. 40,000, that's the population of an entire city, clocking in every single day on one piece of land along East Grand Boulevard. And then it became something else entirely, the largest abandoned industrial site in the world, a 40-acre ruin so vast, so apocalyptic that filmmakers used it as a stand-in for the end of civilization. Urban explorers flew in from Europe and Japan just to walk its collapsing corridors, graffiti-covered walls where engineers once designed 12-cylinder engines. Trees grew through factory floors that had been poured a century earlier, floors so revolutionary when they were built that they changed industrial architecture forever. Here is the question that should keep you watching. This was not a bad factory. It was not a failing company cutting corners. Packard was, for half a century, the gold standard of American luxury, a brand mentioned in the same breath as Rolls-Royce. The factory itself was a marvel, designed by the most influential industrial architect in history. The workforce was skilled. The engineering was world-class. Everything about this place was built to last 100 years. So how does the most advanced automobile factory of its era become the most famous ruin in America? The answer is not one catastrophic mistake. It's a chain of decisions, some of them made in boardrooms 1,000 miles away, some of them made by men who genuinely believed they were saving the company. Each decision, on its own, looked reasonable. Together, they formed a trap that no one saw closing until it was far too late. This is the story of the Packard Automotive Plant, and by the end of it, you'll understand something uncomfortable. The same forces that destroyed this building are still operating today in different industries, in different cities, wearing different disguises. Because history is not just the past, it defines the present. The story begins, strangely enough, not in Detroit, but in Warren, Ohio. November 1999, an engineer named James Packard completes his first automobile. The story goes that Packard had bought a car from the Winton Company, found it unreliable and complained. Winton essentially told him that if he thought he could do better, he should build his own. So he did. And the machine he built was so good that it caught the attention of a group of wealthy Detroit investors, led by a man named Henry Bourne Joy, heir of a railroad fortune.
Joy did something that would reshape an entire city. He convinced the Packard operation to move to Detroit, and in early 1903, he hired a young architect to design a new factory on 40 acres of farmland along East Grand Boulevard. That architect's name was Albert Kahn. Remember that name, because what Kahn did on this site would change how every factory on the planet was built. The first 9 buildings of the Packard complex were conventional for their time. Timber structures, thick walls, limited light, fire hazards, all of them. Wood-framed factories burned constantly in that era, and their heavy internal columns made it nearly impossible to rearrange machinery. But for building number 10, completed in 1905, Kahn tried something radical. Working with a reinforced concrete system developed by his brother Julius, an engineer, he constructed the building's skeleton from concrete strengthened with steel bars. Pause on that for a moment. Today, reinforced concrete is so ordinary that we don't even notice it. In 1905, applying it to a major American automobile factory was revolutionary. The concrete frame meant wide-open floors with fewer columns. It meant enormous windows, flooding the workspace with natural light. It meant a building that wouldn't burn. And it meant floors strong enough to hold heavy machinery on multiple levels. Building number 10 made Albert Kahn the most sought-after industrial architect in the world. Henry Ford saw what Kahn had built for Packard and hired him to design the Highland Park plant, the birthplace of the moving assembly line, then the gigantic River Rouge complex. Kahn's office would eventually design thousands of factories, including hundreds for the Soviet Union's industrialization drive in the 1930s. Every modern factory you have ever seen carries DNA from that one building on East Grand Boulevard. But the building was only half the story. What Packard made inside it, that's what built the legend. Through the 1910s and 1920s, Packard became the defining American luxury automobile. Their advertising slogan was pure confidence, just 5 words: "Ask the man who owns one." No specifications, no price, just the quiet assurance that Packard owners would do the selling themselves. And they did. Packards were purchased by royalty across Europe and Asia. The Japanese imperial household drove them. So did Franklin Roosevelt. When Hollywood stars wanted to signal that they had truly arrived, they didn't buy a Cadillac, they bought a Packard.
The engineering justified the prestige. Packard built magnificent inline 8-cylinder engines, and then in the 1930s, the legendary Packard 12. These were machines assembled with a craftsman's patience in an industry increasingly obsessed with speed and volume. By the mid-1920s, Packard was outselling every other luxury brand in America and doing it profitably. Over the plant's lifetime, more than 1.6 million vehicles would roll out of its gates. Then came October 1929, and the Great Depression did something brutal to the luxury car market. It simply erased it. The clientele who bought 12-cylinder automobiles either lost their fortunes or became terrified of displaying them. Packard's rivals in the ultra-luxury field, Duesenberg, Pierce Arrow, Peerless, Marmon, died one by one. Packard survived. But the way it survived planted a seed of destruction that would take 20 years to fully bloom. In 1935, Packard introduced the 120, a mid-priced car built with mass production methods aimed at the middle class. Commercially, it was a triumph. It saved the company. Sales exploded. But something invisible had been traded away. For 30 years, the Packard name had meant exclusivity. Now a school teacher could buy one. Cadillac, protected inside the fortress of General Motors, could afford to keep its luxury image pure, while its cheaper divisions, Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile, handled the mass market. Packard had no cheaper divisions. It had only its name, and it was now spending that name to survive. Keep that thought in your pocket, because before the consequences arrived, the Packard plant was about to have its finest hour. December 1941. Pearl Harbor. America enters the Second World War, and Detroit transforms into what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Automobile production for civilians stops entirely, and Packard receives one of the most consequential assignments of the entire war, mass-producing the Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft engine under license. Understand what this meant. The Merlin was arguably the finest aircraft engine of the war, the power plant of the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber. But Rolls-Royce built engines the British way, hand-fitted, craftsmen adjusted, one at a time. Packard's engineers had to take that design and re-engineer it for American mass production, thousands of drawings converted, tolerances standardized, so that parts made in Detroit would interchange perfectly. It was one of the great industrial translation projects in history.
The Packard-built Merlin, designated the V1650, was mated to an airframe called the P-51 Mustang, and that combination changed the air war. With the Merlin engine, the Mustang could escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no Allied fighter had been able to do. German fighter losses became unsustainable. When Allied bombers appeared over Germany with swarms of Mustangs beside them, the outcome of the air war was effectively decided. Packard also built marine engines for PT boats, the fast attack craft of the Pacific War, including the boat commanded by a young officer named John F. Kennedy. By the war's peak, roughly 40,000 people worked at the East Grand Boulevard plant, running around the clock. The factory that had built cars for millionaires was now building the machinery of liberation. If the story ended here, the Packard plant would be remembered purely as a monument to American industrial genius. But the war ended, and the post-war world had a trap waiting. 1946. Americans are flush with savings, starved for cars, and every manufacturer can sell everything it builds. For a few golden years, even weak companies look strong. Packard's sales are healthy, its books are profitable, but beneath the surface, three structural problems are quietly compounding, like interest on a debt no one has acknowledged. Problem 1, the plant itself. Albert Kahn's masterpiece was, by 1950, functionally obsolete. Multi-story factories made sense in 1905, when land was expensive and materials moved by elevator. But modern automobile production demanded single-story plants, vast horizontal buildings where a continuous assembly line could flow uninterrupted for a mile. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler were pouring money into sprawling new suburban plants. Packard was still hauling components between floors in a 45-year-old building. The very innovation that made the plant famous, its multi-story reinforced concrete design, had become its cage. Problem 2, scale. In 1950s America, the Big Three were locked in a spending war. Annual restylings, new V8 engines, automatic transmissions, television advertising blitzes. General Motors could spread those costs across millions of cars. Packard sold perhaps 70,000 cars in a good year. The arithmetic of survival for an independent automaker was turning merciless. Every independent, Nash, Hudson, Studebaker, Kaiser, was staring at the same equation. Problem 3, the brand. The prestige spent during the Depression never fully returned. Post-war Packards were solid, well-engineered cars, but they no longer made hearts race. The 1948 models, with their heavy, bulbous styling, earned a devastating nickname from the public: the pregnant elephant. Meanwhile, Cadillac was selling tail fins, glamour, and a modern high-compression V8. Packard didn't launch its own V8 until 1955. In the luxury market, being late is the same as being absent. And then came the blow that history rarely talks about, the one that arguably killed Packard faster than any styling mistake. Packard did not build its own car bodies. For decades, its bodies came from a supplier, the Briggs Manufacturing Company. In 1953, Briggs was sold to Chrysler. Packard's most critical supplier was suddenly owned by a direct competitor. Packard was forced to bring body production in-house, fast, and it made a fateful choice. Rather than modernizing the East Grand Boulevard complex, it leased a plant on Conner Avenue and crammed final assembly into it. The Conner Avenue plant was too small. Workflows were compromised, and the timing could not have been worse because the move coincided with the launch of Packard's most ambitious cars in a generation, the 1955 models, loaded with a new V8 and a genuinely brilliant innovation called torsion-level suspension. The cars were advanced, the production was chaos. Quality problems poured out of the rushed Conner operation, and dealers watched customers walk away. At the precise moment Packard needed a flawless comeback, it delivered its most troubled product launch ever. Behind the scenes, an even bigger gamble was already in motion. In 1954, Packard president James Nance merged the company with Studebaker of South Bend, Indiana, creating the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. On paper, the logic was sound. Combine two independents, share costs, build the scale needed to fight the Big Three.
There was even talk of a grander four-company alliance with Nash and Hudson, a true fourth force in the American auto industry. It never materialized. And the Studebaker merger concealed a bomb. Only after the deal closed did Packard's leadership fully grasp the depth of Studebaker's problems. Its break-even point was catastrophically high, its labor costs bloated, its finances far weaker than Packard had understood. Instead of two companies sharing strength, it was two drowning men tied together. Packard's cash reserves were consumed trying to keep the combined enterprise afloat. By 1956, the end came quickly. Insurance financing fell through, the banks were done. On June 25, 1956, the last true Detroit-built Packard rolled off the line. Production of anything wearing the Packard name shifted to Studebaker's plant in Indiana, where for 2 more years the company sold what enthusiasts bitterly called Packard Bakers, Studebakers with Packard badges. In 1958, the name itself was quietly retired. 59 years after James Ward Packard built his first car, the brand was gone. But here's what makes this story different from every other dead car company. Duesenberg's factory is forgotten. Pierce Arrow's is a footnote. Packard's factory refused to disappear, and its second life would become even more famous than its first. Because a factory doesn't die when the company does. The land was sold and the complex was reborn as the Motor City Industrial Park, 3.5 million square feet carved up and rented to small tenants, chemical processors, storage companies, small manufacturers. For decades, this shadow economy kept the lights partially on. Parts of the plant remained in active use into the 1990s, a fact that surprises people who assumed it was abandoned in 1956.
But the building was aging, and so was the city around it. Detroit's population peaked at 1.85 million in 1950. Then the Great Unwinding began. Factories moving to the suburbs, then to the south, then overseas. The 1967 uprising, white flight, the oil shocks, the collapse of the industrial tax base. By the 2000s, Detroit had lost over 1 million residents, more than half the city gone, entire neighborhoods emptied, and on East Grand Boulevard, the tenants of the old Packard plant drained away one by one. The last significant tenant, a chemical processing company, finally left around 2010. What happened next turned an empty factory into a global icon of collapse. With no security and no functioning ownership, the property was tangled in tax disputes and legal battles for years. The plant was stripped with industrial efficiency. Scrappers tore out every pound of copper wiring, every steel beam they could cut, every scrap of value. Fires burned regularly. Some years, firefighters responded to the complex dozens of times. Sections of concrete floors, weakened by decades of water and freeze-thaw cycles, began pancaking down. Nature moved in with astonishing speed, birch trees growing on rooftops 5 stories above the street. And then the world discovered it. In the 2000s and 2010s, the Packard plant became the cathedral of what critics called ruin photography. Its endless collapsing halls appeared in magazines, documentaries, music videos, and Hollywood films. Photographers from Paris and Tokyo made pilgrimages. For millions of people around the world, these images became the image of Detroit, and Detroiters hated it. Because a ruin that outsiders found hauntingly beautiful was, for the people living beside it, a daily reality of arson, dumping, and danger. 40 acres of open wound in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Then, in 2013, the story took a turn no screenwriter would dare invent. Wayne County put the plant up for tax foreclosure auction. After 2 higher bidders failed to pay, the entire complex, once worth the equivalent of hundreds of millions, sold for $405,000. Read that again. One of the largest industrial complexes ever built in America, sold for roughly the price of a suburban house. Palazuelo arrived with genuine charisma and enormous promises, a 15-year multi-phase renaissance. Offices, galleries, breweries, apartments, light industry. He restored part of the old administration building's shell and held press events in the ruins. For a moment, Detroit, a city hungry for comeback stories in the years after its own municipal bankruptcy, wanted to believe. But the arithmetic never worked. Renovating catastrophically damaged concrete structures costs more than building new ones. Financing never materialized at the scale required. In January 2019, the plant delivered its own grim verdict. The iconic bridge that spanned East Grand Boulevard, the one bearing the painted Packard name, the most photographed piece of the entire site, collapsed onto the roadway below. By October 2020, Palazuelo's renovation efforts had formally stopped, and the city moved to seize parcels and demand demolition. The dream was over. Ironically, the one clear success on the site belonged to someone else entirely. A smaller 1939 building on the boulevard, renovated back in 2015 by a local events company, proving that pieces of the plant could live again, even if the whole could not. The final act began in the fall of 2022. An emergency demolition order came first for a structure on Concord Street judged to be at risk of collapse. Then the excavators moved to Building 21 that October, and the systematic erasure began. The city committed $26 million in federal American Rescue Plan money, with another $12 million approved at the state level. In March 2024, the Detroit mayor stood in front of the ruins and called the Packard plant a source of national embarrassment, a weight, he said, that had hung around the neck of the city's recovery for 68 years. He promised it would be history by the end of the year. And this time, the promise was kept. Through 2024, the machines chewed through Albert Kahn's concrete, the same reinforced structure that had refused to burn, refused to fall, refused to die for over a century, finally surrendering to hydraulic excavators. By December 2024, the demolition was complete. Of 3.5 million square feet, only 2 buildings were deliberately spared. The pair of administration structures facing each other across East Grand Boulevard, a couple 100,000 square feet in total, preserved for their historical significance. Everything else, the halls where Merlin engines were tested, the floors where the Packard 12 was assembled, building number 10 itself, the structure that changed industrial architecture forever, is gone. Cleared land, waiting.
Waiting for what? That question is still open. In late 2025, a $50 million redevelopment plan was announced. Affordable housing, a skate park, even an electronic music museum on the cleared site. By March 2026, that plan had collapsed too, terminated by Detroit's new mayor. Nearly 70 years after the last Packard rolled out, the land still cannot decide what it wants to become. The plant is gone, but the vacuum it left is still there. So let's return to the question we started with. How did the most advanced automobile factory on Earth become America's most famous ruin? Strip away the details, and the answer resolves into a pattern, one that repeats across industrial history with frightening consistency. First, the innovation trap. The Packard plant was destroyed, in part, by its own brilliance. Its revolutionary multi-story concrete design was so durable, so permanent, that it couldn't adapt when the logic of manufacturing changed. The competitors who built later, on cheaper land, with newer layouts, simply drove around it. The lesson is brutal. Yesterday's breakthrough becomes tomorrow's constraint, and durability without adaptability is just a slower form of death. Second, the brand is the balance sheet.
Packard survived the Depression by spending its prestige, and prestige once spent almost never returns at par. Every company that dilutes its identity to survive a crisis should study what happened on East Grand Boulevard.
Third, scale is not optional. Packard didn't lose because it built bad cars. It lost because the structure of its industry changed, because competing in the 1950s required capital that only giants possessed. No amount of engineering excellence can outrun a broken business equation. The independents saw the consolidation wave coming. They simply couldn't merge their way out of it fast enough or honestly enough. And fourth, perhaps the most important, buildings outlive decisions. The men who chose not to modernize the plant, who signed the Studebaker merger, who moved production to Conner Avenue, they were gone within a few years. The building absorbed the consequences for the next 7 decades. The neighborhood absorbed them longer still. Industrial decisions have half-lives measured in generations, and they are paid by people who never sat in the boardroom. Detroit today is not the Detroit of the ruined photographs. New factories are rising near the old Packard site, electric vehicle plants, logistics centers, the early architecture of the next industrial era. The city that built the 20th century is trying to build a piece of the 21st. Whether it succeeds is a story still being written. But stand on East Grand Boulevard today, facing the 2 lonely administration buildings that survived, and you're standing at a warning that applies far beyond Detroit. Somewhere in the world right now, there is a facility, maybe a data center, maybe a battery plant, maybe an entire industrial region that is currently the most advanced of its kind. Its owners believe, as Henry Joy and Albert Kahn believed in 1905, that they are building for a century. The Packard plant reminds us that no one builds for a century. They build for the conditions of their moment, and the moment always ends. The only question is who adapts and who becomes the next ruin that photographers cross oceans to see. Which brings us to the question that should follow you after this video ends. If the most advanced factory of 1905 was a wasteland by 2005, which of today's industrial marvels will our grandchildren walk through as ruins? Think about it, and when you have a candidate in mind, tell me in the comments, because that story might be the next one we tell. History is not just the past, it defines the present.